to join. Today we're going to be talking about Fukushima, and I'm so pleased to have Chiho Kaneko and Norma Field here. Both of these women have devoted the past 10 years to understanding what has been happening and assisting in many, many ways with people who are living day to day with the reality of Fukushima. Chiho almost immediately began helping translating. She's a writer and a visual artist and a performing artist who lives in Heartland, Vermont, but was born in Japan and remains a Japanese citizen with very, very close ties to the area, which she'll tell you a little bit about. Norma Field was a professor at the University of Chicago for 30 years and was just beginning to think about retiring when Fukushima occurred, and it has taken up a lot of her time since then. And Norma, who was born in Tokyo, spent a lot of her early years listening to her parents, an American father and a Japanese mother, arguing about Pacific testing of nuclear weapons in her childhood. So she's been thinking about these issues for quite some time. Chiho also translated for Prime Minister Kan of Japan when he made his first trip to the United States following the Fukushima disaster, and has also translated for atomic bomb survivors. So both of these women have had strong, long ties to the topic. For those of you who are not so familiar with what has been happening at Fukushima, they will provide some insights. There's been a lot written about the 10-year anniversary, especially since Japan is going to be hosting the Summer Olympics whenever they actually occur. But the fact that the Olympics were to take place in Tokyo during what is a continued recognized nuclear state of emergency, a disaster situation, still has been controversial, and I know our speakers will discuss that. But the thing that you need to know about Fukushima, and I'm not going to get into all of the details because there's a lot of conflicting information, is that it's continuing. The nuclear meltdown continues, and there's no signs of when it will actually stop. The Japanese government and TEPCO, the utility company that owns the reactor, have estimated that it would be at least $200 billion to actually decommission the site. There are literally, the New York Times has just reported, I mean, the numbers are astronomical in terms of the continued releases of radioactive water into the Pacific and the impact on sea life. In the days following the disaster, there were all kinds of reports, and we watched the plume cover the world and move to different areas. We heard reports about elevated levels of radioactive particles in fish on the west coast of the United States. Any number of organizations have spoken out about it. There's been a continued attention, but today we're going to be really focused in on what the reality is in Japan, and Chiho and Norma will extrapolate from that with further ruminations on what all this means for the future of nuclear power as the world endures increasingly elevated levels of allowable radiation, and as we make choices about our energy and the economics behind whether nuclear power is actually worth it in the long run. So these are the kinds of topics, and I'm happy now to turn the discussion over to Chiho Kaneko. Welcome, Chiho. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Lisa. It's an honor to be here with Norma. I think we have actually decided that the Norma is going to take the lead. And so, yes, go ahead, Norma.
Thank you. And thank you, Windham World Affairs Council. It was fascinating to hear about you. Thank you, Lissa, for having us here. And thank you, Chiho, for inviting me. It's truly an honor. And I'm so glad to be speaking to all of you from equally spectacular spring-like day afternoon in Chicago. I'm very grateful that Lissa started out by saying that it's the beginning of the disaster. And it's something that always kind of makes me sit up straight, is the phrasing of a Japanese retired nuclear engineering professor, researcher who spent now half a century to putting his knowledge to warning about the dangers of nuclear reactors, is saying, none of us who is alive today, even a baby born today, will live to see this, the Fukushima disaster truly under control. That's the length of the radionuclides, the half-lives that we're dealing with. So it's very sobering to think of the time span. As Lissa said briefly, yes, I was born and raised in Japan, a product of World War II, insofar as my father was an occupation American soldier and my mother a Japanese woman living near where the occupation moved, settled. And I did grow up hearing my parents argue about this. The disaster of March 11th, 2011 swept me in like a cyclone in a way, back to the origins of my radiation consciousness of those arguments, to my first seeing images of the victims of the Hiroshima atomic bomb, hearing arguments, well, the persuasiveness, the advertisement of the Japanese government sometime in the 1960s that the Japanese people had to be gotten over their so-called nuclear allergy, because it was really time to take in the benefits of atoms for peace, phrase we might be coming back to from time to time. I spent my career at the University of Chicago, which was one of the major homes of the Manhattan Project. And I know from reading old issues of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, how many of the first Manhattan scientists really wanted something redemptive to come out of this quite terrifying technology that they had developed. And so I think there was, at least initially, some sincerity about atoms for peace, but with some very grave consequences that I don't think were foreseen then. So I saw the Japanese government trying to persuade Japanese citizens that nuclear power was great, and that indeed did take hold. Much later, I remember, but having grown up with such early skepticism, fear really about radiation exposure, and particularly knowing that the effects are delayed, that being exposed doesn't mean that you drop dead or even within 2 weeks, that it can be years and decades before illnesses emerge themselves. That's a particular kind of dread, one that is stretched out over time and with uncertainty. So having grown up with that, I was never really persuaded by getting over the nuclear allergy. I thought it was a healthful allergy, in fact, but I didn't know much about it. As talk about climate change came in, at one point I thought, okay, is this it? Climate change is really serious, so we have to accept it. And I remained skeptical for a while until I got to know more about the consequences of Chernobyl and the consequences of downwinders living around nuclear facilities in the continental US and elsewhere. I had a very close friend and colleague who studied the impact of Chernobyl on the indigenous children of Scandinavia. And by studying that impact, she was able to diagnose her own lifetime of sickliness as a consequence, probably, of her having grown up downwind of the Hanford plutonium facilities in Washington State. She died at the age of 46, alas, but she, for me, is a concrete, a particular wonderful embodiment. I mean, a wonderfully lively person with so much to offer us, who brought together with her knowledge and her own body the link between the development of nuclear weapons and the exercise of nuclear power. So when Fukushima happened, these were all the things that I was swept into, and really feel that it is what I will devote the rest of my life to, trying to learn about and be useful in ways that I can. So it was a great surprise and pleasure in a way to actually meet Chiho, with whom we've had overlapping paths and met very special people, and she will talk about that soon. So I want to turn this over to Chiho to tell us how she comes to all of us today.
Thank you, Norma. I think I'm going to start the slide now. Just to place all the locations that we're going to mention in this talk. Well, here is Fukushima Prefecture, and this is Tokyo. This is Iwate Prefecture, where I am from. And like from this reactors that melted down are right here. And from here to the center of Iwate, that's where my hometown is. It's roughly 150 miles. And this morning, it occurred to me, 10 years ago today, to the day, March 21st, 2011, at this time, I was actually flying to Japan because I had a ticket to go to Japan at the end of March. And then the big earthquake happened and everything just went crazy. And initially, trying to figure out if my families are safe. We couldn't get a hold of each other for a few days. And I think a State Department, United States State Department said the people are not to be traveling to Japan, especially if they're not Japanese citizens. But I really felt like I needed to honor this ticket and decided to go back. And if anything, to really share the most traumatic event of our lifetime today, anyway, with my family and friends. So I went to Japan soon after the big earthquake and tsunami. And initially it was that, earthquake and tsunami. I mean, those alone were so devastating visually and emotionally that our minds were just focused on this, especially for people in Iwate. And, my parents and my sisters they're inland, but we all have close families and friends on the coast. And some of those people either died or house swept away. And I made a trip to the coast on a couple of occasions and bringing relief goods and helping with cleanup after the tsunami. And at the time, we were all wearing masks and trying not to breathe this really mixture of toxic debris, basically seawater that carried everything from household, items to industrial poison to sewage. So we were all wearing masks, and it crossed my mind at the end of March and early April, 10 years ago, I knew if Fukushima melted down, but maybe we are far enough, or are we safe enough? And during that first trip, we didn't really know much about the extent of radiation pollution. But in subsequent visits, I started to learn more and more that how widespread the pollution, nuclear fallouts are. And so that's when I started to really try to find out what's really happening in Japan. Because on one hand, there's a government announcement, and this is how things are. And on the other hand, a lot of chatter on the internet that the people are finding out something contrary to what the government, official announcements are. So that led me to visiting Fukushima, and a friend introduced me to this wonderful woman, Ruiko Muto, who lives in town of Miharu. And she has become the voice of people in Fukushima who were outraged by the irresponsible treatment of its residents by the government and the Tokyo Electric Company. Well, I think Norma can talk a lot more about this, but she's somebody who tried to live an authentic and very gentle life, not relying on nuclear power or anything like that. And look at those solar panels on her house. And she was truly a gentle soul. And yet, even her life was overnight turned upside down. She could not use her wood stove anymore because, if she burned the wood from outside, she'll be sending radioactive particles in the air. And I think when one of my last visits with her was 2 years ago, and she said something like, these days, even such words as recovery, dreams, hope, and future have been hijacked. The activities undertaken in the name of recovery do not represent a genuine recovery. They are hollow. To be told to live normally under continuing state of emergency produces a series of distortions. And the word distortion really stuck in me. Distortion, well, the word in Japanese was hizumi. Hizumi really actually, can be also seismological terminology. It's when plate goes under another plate, it creates pressure and almost like a distortion or squeeze, that unsustainable squeeze. That's hizumi. But she was describing the whole state, her state of her existence, or state of the existence of people in Fukushima, not just in Fukushima, in so many people. They are in that squeeze, unsustainable squeeze and distortion. And when Norma and I were preparing for this presentation, we thought, geez, everything can be explained in that word, hizumi, distortion. So we decided to organize in so many ways that the aftermath of the meltdowns created those distortions. Okay, your turn, Norma.
Okay, thanks. So we look at the next slide.
Yeah.
All right, evacuation zones. So first of all, I want to emphasize how narrowly the evacuation zones were defined, starting with 3 kilometers and then 5 and 10, and maximally 20 for mandatory evacuation. And as I put on this slide, let's keep in mind that the US recommended to American citizens that they get 80 kilometers or 50 miles further. So huge difference in allowable perception of risk already. The marked areas are the areas that were the narrow zones with a little bit exceeding, I don't know, that you can see part of the original 20 kilometer zone here. It goes through here and then
this one, right?
Yeah, right here. And then, right, thank you. And then some of it exceeded because information by the fancy computer simulation program was shared with the US military, but not Japanese citizens. So they fled in the direction of the plume. And there were many, many mishaps, some of which we might say wouldn't necessarily happen at such a moment, others that showed awareness enough not to share it with this vital information with your own citizens. In any case, I think it will be obvious to all of you that radioactivity doesn't travel in well-defined concentric circles. So there's already a problem with that. It's probably easy. I share the understanding of many people in Fukushima that these zones didn't extend further because it's right down the center of the prefecture and what's called the central road, the central path, that the prefecture capital is, that the bullet train goes running through, major highway, places that you couldn't block off if you really value commercial activity over all else. So given that, the zones were narrowly defined and there were many people, so people who left from the mandatory zones got more support from the state. Those who were called voluntary evacuees from outside the 20 kilometer zone, called voluntary, it wasn't exactly that they were wanting to leave their homes and families and communities, but therein is one enormous source of the fracturing of community, which is another theme of our presentation of what's going on, that it's not just a compensation money was used that divided people. Someone living next door getting much more than you did. What's the difference? Someone living next door being in the mandatory zone and you in the voluntary, and therefore only receiving short-term housing assistance. In all those ways, money and benefits, as usually happens, and I do want to emphasize that I don't think this is peculiarly awful behavior, peculiar to Japanese. In fact, I recently heard a presentation of a study showing that it's when disasters are said to be human-made, they invariably create terrible divisions, whereas natural disasters, if they're understood to be natural, mostly or entirely, then they bring people together. Well, this has been very much the opposite. So people evacuating, it created rifts, not just in communities, but within generations of a household. If your mother-in-law didn't want you to take off with the kids, that was a huge source of strain. Very often, many mothers left with their children, leaving husbands to stay home and pay the mortgage, for instance, of the newly built home and continue to work. Children themselves were anguished. They felt guilty leaving behind their classmates whose families weren't in a position to leave. So this has been a really difficult thing. It has also, in their evacuation sites, sometimes within Fukushima Prefecture, often within Fukushima Prefecture, and beyond, evacuees and evacuee children encountered bullying. And the myth was spread quickly that evacuees had managed to get a lot of money, and kids were held up for money by their classmates. There are many stories of that kind. So it's just been, the definition of evacuation zones has been its own set of distortions created within the community. So let's look at the Olympic slide. The Olympics, won by former Prime Minister Abe in 2013 in Buenos Aires by declaring that Fukushima was under control. Well, of course it wasn't, as TEPCO itself denied hastily the following day. But the Olympics has been one of the major drivers of this hijacked recovery. The Olympics have been touted as the reconstruction or recovery Olympics to announce to the world that Japan has overcome the Fukushima disaster and it's up and running. It's what has the Olympics, first of all, with the rush to create new facilities in Tokyo and elsewhere, has meant that a lot of skilled and unskilled construction workers were siphoned off to Tokyo, so materially delaying recovery in Fukushima itself. There was the best defense is a good offense. So let's host some of the games in Fukushima City Park. Let's start the torch relay in Fukushima itself. The top picture shows a rally just a few days ago in front of J Village, which used to be the National Soccer Training Center and then was turned over as the front line in a way for Fukushima containment. So you had all those vehicles that were driving in and out of the Fukushima Daiichi site. You had workers taking their suits on and off. It was an extraordinarily contaminated area, as you might imagine. And then basically returned by TEPCO with very sketchy remediation. So to suggest that this is an appropriate site for the rally to start is extremely, well, it's chutzpah of a very special sort. And here are protesters to say that really in Fukushima, we don't have time, we don't have the resources, we don't have the energy to be having any part of hosting the Olympics Games. And then in the latter two pictures, the torch relay route was, as it was defined and it was understood that Fukushima would be part of it, these two communities that hosted, continue to host Fukushima Daiichi, the broken, still leaking and rattling reactors that were originally not going to be included in the route, their mayors begged to have their towns included. So there was a very hasty cleanup, and you can see this splendid new train station. And then on one side of the train station, it's still a no-go zone. And you see all of these black container bags full of decontamination waste, in other words, of contaminated soil and other largely organic materials, with, lo and behold, these letters, which are hard to read, but it says, now let's get going with Futaba, that's the station, Futaba's future. So the very idea that people would label those bags of contaminated waste as a sign of a recovered, wonderful, spanking new future already shows you that something's gone deeply awry with the collective psyche here. Okay. Oh, and this recovery also means the reopening of train lines, which are going to be, which have been carrying contamination back and forth back to Tokyo. It is part of the ongoing spread or redistribution, someone has said, of the contamination that huge taxpayer money and exposed labor went in to try to keep in one place. But this has been going on the whole time. Maybe we look at that next slogan quickly. This is the Futaba town where we saw the brand new station. This is a community where there are currently no residents. It's another crazy part of having the torch relay go through there. These are sixth graders' words from a 1987 contest. This sixth grader now, I think a man in his early 40s, he might have been 39 at the time of the disaster. He's very vocal and visible on this. And he and his wife have had themselves photographed and put up other signs to say, it's not an energy for a bright future. It's the energy that has destroyed our future. This sign was removed by the township on the grounds that it was no longer sound. And then it was stuck in the storage of a brand new memorial museum that has opened, and which is extremely controversial because the question is, what memories are going to be preserved? We're already talking about memories. Well, it's good to keep records. And there's already been censorship that's been reported a number of times, and the volunteers speaking about their experiences. So it's gotten quite a bit of publicity, this new memorial museum, and there was enough citizen pressure. And it's always good to note when citizen action can make a difference, however small. So apparently this sign is now going to be included as part of the exhibit. But what I want to show here is that there's a huge effort to do away with any of the artifacts that can point to the fact that an ongoing disaster happened and is continuing to happen. It's the obliteration of that history and present that is ongoing. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Wow. Well, so now we're moving on to another aspect of distortion, the myth of nuclear safety. And I guess I would like to start from the origin of nuclear technology, which is basically, it was primarily developed to kill people, right? And in the form of nuclear weapons. And it's an extremely lethal and uncontrollable technology. Yeah. So, and the term atoms for peace that the Norma mentioned, yes, that was advertised in Japan as well, I'm sure. And it's a little curious because United States granted so much ability for Japanese to accumulate all these nuclear capabilities over the past, 50, 60 years. And, part of it was the bilateral agreement, I think, that, US allowed Japan to develop nuclear facilities, provided that Japan will buy all the material from United States. I think that was the original agreement, but over the years it got expanded, and more Japan was able to build nuclear power plants and even reprocessing plant. And some argue that might be part of a United States strategic plan to use Japan as a sort of a buffer against the other nations of the world. And so that, I don't know for sure, but that indicates the aspect of Japan still being a lesser of the two countries. Some people even call Japan a colony of United States. And when it comes to nuclear policy, I don't think Japan can make the policy but on its own. So let's go back to Fukushima. On the right, you see this map of, well, it's a little hard to see, but I can't really touch that now. These are soil samples that the ordinary citizens, the citizen scientists, grassroots movement, network of people collected and tested. I mean, this is amazing thing about, modern day nuclear disaster, that people actually purchase on their own or collectively, those Geiger counters and soil testing equipment. Some of those and monitoring devices cost tens of thousands of dollars, but people did. And somehow they were able to, communicate with each other. So there is a network called Minna no, it says Minna no data site, everyone's data site. So they pull the findings and then make this, collective map of contamination. It's pretty reliable because it's based on actual samples. And it really shows how widespread the contamination is, except if you look at some of the simulation of the 3 meltdowns, because there are some videos on internet, you realize that the vast majority of plume went into the Pacific. So this is just a fraction of the nuclear pollution that was spewed out of the meltdowns. Had the wind direction been opposite, I think that even my hometown would be rendered uninhabitable. And when I realized that, can I say we were extremely lucky? Or should I say, I don't know if luck has anything to do with it. We are really gambling with our fate. And so what the impact of this fallout was even felt in my home area of Iwate. Even though it's, you think it's far enough, maybe it's not far enough. So they started to test soil, food, eventually, this is months later. And a lot of food items went up on the list of restricted agricultural products or fishery products. And things like mushrooms, wild mushrooms, some of the most contaminated food items. Even today, I think some of those mushrooms are on the list even 10 years later. And wild edibles, like in the springtime, people in Japan go to the field, mountainside, and then collect all kinds of greens, fresh greens, brackens and a fern to any shoots. And a lot of them are found to be more contaminated. And things like also wild game, venison, birds, wild birds, and some freshwater trout. Those things went up on the list. And hay. I can attest to that because I have a family member, a relative who was a dairy farmer. His farm was north of Morioka, but still they tested his soil of his hay field, and said that the cesium level is too high, that he couldn't sell his hay. So he basically quit his dairy operation. He died suddenly 5 years ago. at the age of, I don't know exactly, in his 60s. Farmers, organic farmers. This is my friend, organic farmer. These are ducklings who eventually become her rice fields, weeding helper. Organic farmers, their livelihood, their whole reason of their, existence, livelihood depends on the sound soil and air. And even though these people, no matter how carefully they tended and nurtured their land, once meltdown happens, nuclear pollution happens, they have no control. So even their land is contaminated. And what's more, my friend farmer, she has a CSA program, community supported agriculture. So she has customers. But right after the meltdown, some of the customers called her and said, you know what, I don't want to get food from Iwate. So I'm going to cancel my subscription. So nuclear pollution ended up not only contaminating the land, but also severing some of the human relationship that's essential to farmers. And not only that, my friend farmer said, the farmers are people who were exposed most because they're always outside and they're close to the soil. And that really makes me sad because, I'm also an organic home grower, and not to be able to breathe your own fresh air or eat food from your garden is unthinkable. So I think I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Okay, yes, it is painful. So I want to go quickly about myth of exposure safety. So the idea was after Chernobyl, well, those are Soviet clunky reactors. This will never happen in technologically advanced Japan with such high quality of workers and scientists. And it happened. So it's no longer possible to say that to insist literally on the myth of safety of the technology. So the myth of safety migrated onto exposure. This much exposure isn't going to hurt anyone. And that has been bolstered in a number of ways. The first is going back to the history of the atomic bombs. The fact that Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors were discriminated against in marriage and occupation, that memory was instantly revived. And we know that Fukushima people, as they fled, as they evacuated, oftentimes encountered having their tires slashed, being refused stay, some of it possibly child bullying as well. So the failure of Japanese society to really come to terms with what it meant to discriminate against the survivors of the A-bombs came back to life here. And that's been used by people to say, if you talk about if you express your worries about Fukushima produce, if you worry about the water, if you worry about the soil, you are hurting Fukushima. You are contributing to discrimination against Fukushima. So instead of thinking about what that discrimination against the A-bomb survivors might have meant, and what the reality of continuing not to disseminate accurate information, between the two, Fukushima people, I think, have been really squeezed. And I understand also the reluctance to speak out of those who feel powerless. If you feel powerless to do anything about the conditions that are terrifying and oppressing you, and you are also really worried about your children and your future, then I think silence is something that happens quite readily. So yes, the worry of being discriminated against, and the worry also of, and it's related, bad rumors about your land and your products. That is a constant force that has led to a hijacked recovery that feels very hollow. Let's take a quick look at the thyroid cancer. So the only illness that the official Western powers, IAEA et al., recognized from Chernobyl is pediatric and youth thyroid cancer. And this is very typical. I've labeled the slide, should school thyroid screenings continue? Why? Because so many thyroid cancers have turned up among children. And one of the easiest ways to detect these is to have ultrasound screenings in school. They're not compulsory, and they're free, and it provides for early detection. But now, again, this is making visible what was supposed to be invisible, right? That being contaminated by radiation, you weren't supposed to, because you can't see radionuclides. If you can only get rid of any of the traces, material in terms of bags, or in terms of, in the case of bodies of traces of illness, then you can keep on pushing the recovery narrative. So that's one of the things happening here. And then if we can quickly look at the next slide. So much is kept away. People, parents and children can have a hard time finding out. Many parents, certainly the children, now grown, many of them who went through the thyroid screening, had thyroid cancer, and had their surgeries. Many of them are saying, no, the school screening is the most effective way. It's how things can be found quickly. But because the prefectural government, with money from the central government, has really tried to cut, and with its experts, has tried to cut down. In other words, don't find out, don't look and don't find out. I saw a question in chat, by the way, about death counts. Well, this is part of the answer. There's a huge effort not to look and not to find out. So this private fund is a place where children and families from 17 prefectures, not just Fukushima, can get support when their children are diagnosed with cancer for additional medical treatment. And so there's support for medical treatment, but also sociality. They get so isolated. The worry of discrimination and just plain worry has kept so many of these children and their parents isolated. And this fund has helped create an alternative place, plus showing where the prefectural study is missing case counts. Okay.
Well, so, we have to talk about nuclear waste. Well, this is a very difficult topic, so I'm going to start a little lightheartedly. This is a horse parade that takes place every year in June in my hometown, Morioka, because horses were the workmate family for many centuries for farmers, and this is a day to honor, dress up horses, and then have a long parade. Well, what struck me, I saw this a few years ago for the first time in years. What struck me was after the parade, look at these people walking behind the parade and picking up the droppings. They figured it out how to clean out the waste. How can we figure out how to clean up our nuclear waste? Well, since Lissa at the introduction talked quite extensively about these containers and the debris and what to do with them, and now they are piled up on the coast of Fukushima. I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but I just want to say during the rush to clean up after the tsunami, so much debris was burned all over Japan, and I'm sure a lot of them were contain radionuclides. So in essence, I think Japanese government's policy to quickly build temporary incinerators all over Japan and burn the evidence was basically contaminating the entire Japan fairly, almost evenly, not completely evenly, but it really spreading the nuclear pollution, which was so unfortunate. And you might have seen the picture of images of these tanks. Well, these are at the Fukushima Daiichi site today. Basically, in order to keep those melted down core. You still have to pour water every day, all the time. Otherwise, you're going to have another blow up. So constantly, they're just putting new water into the containment vessels. But then you are creating more and more uncontaminated water. So they treat it, but they cannot remove tritium and other radionuclides. So they store. But the capacity is maxing out, I think by summer, this next year, I can't remember, this summer or next summer, but they're saying it's going to max out. I think already over 1 million tons of water is stored. And the government and Tokyo Electric Company want to start releasing this water into the Pacific, saying that it will be diluted by the ocean. Well, that argument is absurd because the absolute amount of radionuclides doesn't change, even though it's diluted. So you're basically dumping this toxic waste into the ocean, and fish will eat it. So there's bioconcentration, and people eat it. And it's really a pollution to the world. And it's a nuisance, and it's a really bad thing for the world. But I just want to talk about tritium a little bit, because tritium is a byproduct of every nuclear power generation. So even with that meltdown, your local power plants are producing tritium, and that is a problem because tritium cannot be removed from water. Tritium is a hydrogen, it's an isotope. It's basically hydrogen. Its makeup is like hydrogen. So H2O has 2 hydrogens, and tritium binds quickly with water. So there's no way you can remove tritium from water in today's technology. So if you take tritium water in your body in the form of, say, eating fish or whatever, or even evaporated from the air, your body takes tritium in, but then since your body is majority water, it becomes your organ and it stays in your system for a long time. And so your body is from inside always being exposed. And maybe someday it might create cancer. I think there's more and more study done about tritium. So then that relates to this reprocessing plant, which is in Rokkasho, which is above Iwate Prefecture, in a different prefecture here. It's on the coast. Japan has one of the few nuclear reprocessing plants in the world. And what it does is to try to extract uranium and plutonium out of spent nuclear fuel. But it will end up creating highly radioactive liquid nuclear waste. And now they are trying to figure out how to safely store that by the process called the vitrification, putting powdered glass and melt it and put in this canister like this. But I think it's this size. No, I haven't seen it, because if you're near it, you would die in 20 seconds. But so now I think in Japan, there are something like a 2,500 vitrified containers already exist, but this is just the tip of iceberg. If they fully operate this reprocessing plant, I think Iwate, which is basically downstream, the current goes like this from Rokkasho. So we are very concerned. The fishery associations in Iwate are really, really against the full operation of this Rokkasho reprocessing plant. So I guess we should move on to this.
To nuclear colonialism, big topic. Quickly, just let me say that obviously the whole history of nuclear experimentation with bomb testing has relied on getting uranium, for example, from the former Belgian Congo, shipping that uranium. Now, uranium mines in largely native lands in the United States, there's that kind of nuclear colonialism. There's the colonialism of using the sites, former colonies, France and Algeria or Polynesia for its testing, China to the far west, the United States, Marshall Islands, and various parts of the Pacific. So in a way, the nuclear age has depended on colonial and imperial relations. And I might remind us here that 1 kilowatt hour produced at Fukushima Daiichi went to Fukushima. It all was generation for Tokyo. So that's another kind of poor communities, northern Japan, historically known in that way. Poor communities having little capacity to resist, although some have, the siting of a nuclear power plant. So if we could quickly look at the map of waste transfer in the US to bring it closer to home. This is a wonderful map produced by the Nuclear Issues Study Group in Albuquerque. I recommend you look them up on Facebook because they have wonderful resources. But if you see how nuclear power plants are concentrated in the eastern half of the United States, a few in California, up in Washington State, the proposal currently, after Yucca Mountain came and went, is to ship them all to this corner of New Mexico, which is already highly, highly contaminated, in this part of Texas, consolidated storage sites. There's so many problems with shipping on our depleted infrastructure, where at every point of the way, some ones are going to risk exposure. And then to bring these less than sturdy canisters to store in these places. Anyway, it is just a disaster waiting to happen. But you can also see how unequally the burdens and the risks will be shared or spread in that case. And also remember that most of the uranium mines that have long been contaminating the lives of local people, people of color, indigenous people, are in that area. So, okay, let's.
Yes, so this is one of such a road to uranium mines located in the Oglala Sioux tribal land. I personally visited this place. It's beautiful, and this is a whole another story. So I will not go into detail here, but this area they have thousands of territories, thousands of abandoned uranium mines and prospects, and they keep contaminating air and the river and making people and livestock and everything ill. I think the cancer rate in the northern plains is very high. And so in conclusion, I think you.
Yeah, this is a statement by a scholar of technology of science who died in 1991 at a very early age. And although I have this book, I hadn't come across this statement that Chiho pointed me to, which I realize now is widely known, but let me just read it. The current standards of radiological protection have been devised by those who impose radiation exposure on others for the purpose of promoting atomic weapons and energy. Their purpose, that is to say, the standards of protection, their purpose is to persuade the public that exposure cannot be helped and must therefore be endured. They are social standards painstakingly presented in the guise of science, and they are the administrative means for supporting the development of atomic energy politically and economically.
Well, how frustrating it is that in the name of national security and economic prosperity and things like that, we have lost the freedom to breathe clean air. Well, so much to think about. And thank you, Norma, for walking this really challenging path with me.
Thank you, Chiho. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have needed each other, and we will continue to.
Yes. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I'd like to open it up now to questions. I'm sure that, we have only 2 questions right now in the chat, but I'm going to just ask my own because I'm curious about, the New York Times had a big article about the continued inability of the government to really handle the amount of contamination that continues to build up and needs to be put somewhere. And there have been a number of releases already ongoing into the Pacific Ocean. But I'm interested in the Japanese government's response to people's concerns regarding the evacuation. So I understand that there's a 12-mile evacuation area that's still pretty much abandoned. And the Times was reporting some photos in eerie, empty villages. But what really is the situation now with those? How many people had to approximately leave? How big is the area that is no longer occupied? And could you describe some of the dynamics that are ongoing in terms of the government's response to people who have had to evacuate, and the response in terms of their return? Where's that all at? I mean, the people are still displaced. How large is the abandoned kind of zone around the reactors?
Shall I give us, I don't know if we want to look at that map again, but the zone around the reactors is very small and ever decreasing. One thing I didn't bring up is that one of the responses of the Japanese government has been to declare that evacuees can return once the air dose rate, which is another problematic measurement, but let's just use it, has gone down to, is under 20 millisieverts per hour. That figure will make no sense to you, except if I tell you that the standard around the world for the regular public is 1 millisievert an hour. So this is 20 times the rate observed around the world and in the rest of Japan, for that matter. But the government is insisting that below 20 is safe. That is, by the way, the standard for, that's an occupation standard. In other words, for people who work in the nuclear industry, their annual exposure is supposed to be kept 20 or no higher than 20. In times of emergency, no higher than 50 in 1 year, but still no higher than 100 cumulatively in 5 years. So 20 years. So in other words, children, babies who, children are much more radio sensitive. All of those people are being told by the government that it is appropriate for them to conduct their daily lives in circumstances that are normally reserved only for those who earn a living from this. I'm not saying that is desirable either. What kind of technology is this that exposes workers to that kind of hazard? But in any case, it's actually completely violating its own regulations to call this, there's an emergency. So these are all areas under emergency declaration, which experts who are being honest and remembering what's what will tell you, first of all, no one under 18 is legally, under current Japanese law, supposed to be in such an area. You're not supposed to eat, drink, or sleep in such an area. You're not supposed to carry anything out of such an area. Well, that has all been thrown to the winds from quite early on, to begin with, by the narrow evacuation zone, and the ever narrowing one, and with raising the goal or lowering the goalpost, really, so to say that 20 is fine. Lots of people have returned because they couldn't support dual households. It was just too hard not to have family or friends around. Other people are staying on. They've joined lawsuits. They are among the most, I think we should be really grateful to these brave and stalwart evacuees who, because they made this great break, this decision, feel much freer to speak out about the realities of the situation. Wonder if there's anything you want to add to that, Chiho?
So I was thinking to answer some of Lissa's questions about, what's happening. So as you see, the plume, the way it goes, it's not concentric, right? So people, even though they're fairly close to the reactors, this area might not be as contaminated as, say, this area, right? So this is much farther out, but the way wind blew on that particular day when the meltdown happened, I think this area is much more contaminated. But this town of Itate, for instance, I remember recently there was a poll of stats, and 30% of its its village people have returned, something like that. And it varies depending on the towns around here. Obviously, this town of Futaba, nobody has gone back. I don't believe it yet, right? And so it really depends. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Maybe not.
Well, there's just so many questions. It's hard. It's hard to really zero in. Let me go to some of the questions from the audience, though. Let's take one from one of our board members, Scott Cooper, who writes, I would think a tsunami would be an obvious natural disaster in an earthquake-prone area. What on earth possessed any company to build so close to the coast?
It's a cost thing, because they need to be close to water, right? To get water, to discharge wastewater. I mean, Vermont Yankees on Connecticut River, right? All the nuclear power plants, they need water. So if you're farther from the coastline, then your infrastructure is more elaborate and expensive. And I think they cut corners.
And I think it's known that they cut corners. And one of the key aspects of the criminal trial, Chiho showed us a photo of Ruiko Muto, the head of the complainants, because the complainants being citizens who were saying the prosecutors aren't doing their job by looking into this crime of criminal neglect is the argument. But one of the key pieces of evidence that has come out is that TEPCO had warnings from national earthquake experts about the likelihood of a tsunami earthquake in the X number of years. Within TEPCO itself, plans had already been developed for building a seawall that would account for the tsunami predictions. And here again, it was cost. No. What do companies do when the likelihood of bad news comes in? Well, commission another study. And that's exactly what happened. And then March 11th took place.
Yeah, it's often said that Fukushima was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made one. They also, the site of the nuclear power plant, according to reports that I've read, was actually higher up in the beginning, and they lowered the hill so that they would be easier to build. So there were some really pretty stupid decisions made early on. Let's go back to the chat. Take one from Cyrus Shaul. Cyrus writes, how can the public get trustworthy data on the amount of radiation in the air, water, and soil? Should all citizens begin trying to monitor their local environment? And maybe as part of this question, you could talk about the citizen groups who formed that are measuring radiation, and also the many, many lawsuits that you touched on, but what is the nature of those lawsuits as well? So there's the radiation question, and then how citizens are trying to respond to that.
Yes, so there are about 30 civil cases in that one criminal trial that are winding their way through the courts in the appeals process. With some, I would say, with a few good decisions. But let's remember the centralized nature of the Japanese apparatus. And so the higher up we go, people get a little bit grimmer about the prospects of judges feeling independent. But we've had a couple of high court decisions acknowledging the plaintiff's complaints. So, right, measurement. I think one of the things from that map that Chiho showed us that's really important is that, as you can imagine, Measurement isn't is is you if you don't have standardized protocol, you're going to get very different results. The thing that was really important about the map that Chiho showed us was that it's soil measurements. So we're not using drones at a certain height, extrapolating then to 1 meter above the ground and then, you know, closer, etc. 1 meter is a key issue because how tall are children? How close are they to the ground? So the soil measurement issue has been really, really important for activists. And that particular group made a concerted effort that everyone would be doing it in a uniform way so that the results would have a greater amount of consistency. And there are other places that concentrate on measuring food, other places water. So there's a variety of that kind of practice. One of the things I think that's come out that surprises us is how much contamination there has been since World War II, right? You can find, there's a famous map online, I think it's by one Richard Miller, of the continental United States, showing all the places that have been crossed over by plumes from the Nevada test site. And you'll see that parts of the continental United States are completely black, and it's pretty much spread all over. So we still have radioactive contamination from all of that testing. Japan has contamination from the Pacific tests. And some people have now found that, well, you dig this far and you're going to get this radionuclide from the Pacific testing. And if you dig only this much, you get the cesium from Fukushima. So by their kinds of differences that people are finding out, I think that if we were to start, you know, monitoring our own soil, I mean, we would probably be surprised at as the experts say, we are surrounded by radioactivity. That's not false. And moreover, because of all of this testing, because of the ubiquity of nuclear power plants, what's called natural background level has been a moving goalpost. And it becomes harder and it becomes easier and easier. Let me put it another way to say, oh, the levels here are not much higher than background levels. Well, that'll be true because we've been contaminating consistently.
So you're right. I mean, I think after the Fukushima meltdowns, Japan quickly put together standards, you know, the limits of the how much radiation can be in the food items, specific food items, water. I think they set standards, right? Becquerels per kilogram. And that standards compared to the United States standards, which practically is none. You know, EPA has a guideline, but there is no restriction in the United States. And even the guideline is like 6 times or much higher than the Japanese ones. So I think when you said, you know, how citizens find out the contamination, I thought you were talking about United States, because I mean, at least, you know, more and more people are walking around with Geiger counters and things like that. But here, I don't think people really understand.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say something because I read it right now. So Japan, at some point after the disaster, set for food 100 becquerels per kilo. And of course, people, you know, if you keep eating 100 becquerels for a year after year and you're a young person, obviously the impact is greater. But the Codex, which is some standardized international system, allows for 1,000, in some cases, 1,200 becquerels per kilo. And now there's a move by the Japanese government to say, hey, let's go with international standards and raise our limits from 100 to 1,000. And I was just reading this morning, let's remember before Fukushima, this was a science teacher saying 100 becquerels per kilo was the standard for measuring radioactive waste in Japan. Mm-hmm. And that then became the standard of food. And now the proposal is to raise it to 1,000.
And of course, the allowable radiation levels are being increased by the United States government and other governments worldwide year to year. So this is a byproduct of our modern life that we, you know, have to consider when we make our energy choices. There's a question from Mary Olson. I wonder if you would reflect on the decisions parents, particularly mothers, have had to make about how they are treated for taking steps to better protect their children than the official practices?
That's
You want to talk about that, Chiho?
what you can talk about that. Yeah.
It's really hard, you know. I mean, as I said earlier, well, I didn't bring up the phrase, but the Fukushima divorce is one way to answer that question. I think, well, very concrete case. Um, another way, another manifestation of the hijack recovery is Fukushima recovery has to begin at home. We have to show that our food stuff is safe by eating it. And the best way to show that is to use, that wonderful practice, locally grown produce in school lunches. Well, that did alarm. I bet it alarmed practically every parent. However, and so what resistance could they mount? They said, well, all right, maybe we could just for a few days, at least for a few days, send rice, the rice part of our children's lunches from home. And then, but then there are so many ways in which children and mothers are discouraged with the classroom teacher saying, well, your child will be the only one doing this, but go ahead if that's how you feel. That kind of thing, which is, you have to weigh on the one hand, the ostracizing of your child, and on the other hand, your peace of mind that you're trying to contain their intake. So that kind of micro decision has had to be made so many times, and you can understand how people get exhausted trying to do that. A lot of, there's a favorite phrase like, oh, you're still worried about that kind of thing? Even by people, I mean, I know this of someone who herself, I believe, had a citizens monitoring post saying that to someone. So it's not that people are ignorant when they are silent or when they question others. I think the constant burden, psychological burden with living in a contaminated land with official policy that denies A, the contamination, and B, where it recognizes it, insists that it's harmless, is extraordinary. And I don't blame mothers and grandmothers for giving up on it. And I think on the other hand, the ones who are toughing it out are extraordinary. And one thing, we're still only 10 years into this. And filmmaker Kamanaka said, I wonder what these children 10 years from now, 15 years from now, as they see perhaps more of their classmates and friends getting sick, or they themselves get thyroid issues, not to mention many others, how are they going to think about their parents who encouraged them, perhaps pressured them to adapt?
That leads us to another question from the audience, which is regarding the collection of data, health data caused by the nuclear contamination. How is it being collected? Is there an effort on the part of the government or others to track it through hospital records and doctors? How are doctors reacting to it? Is there any effort to try to, you said before, if you don't ask, you don't know, and we certainly find that here too. But is there any asking going on?
Well, there is a cursor effort to, track, monitor, especially thyroid cancer among children, because that is the unfortunately, the only thing that the international community authorities, international, atomic energy agency, the WHO, recognize that as potential health effects after nuclear meltdown. Even that assumption is really skewed, but that's a whole another story. So they started to track it, that like something like 300,000 children, Fukushima children who were 18 or young at the time. But even that is mired, as Norma was saying, mired with a lot of issues, because everything is record keeping centralized. And Fukushima Medical University, they are the only credible, something as far as the government is concerned, authority to collect data. And I think there's a lot of distrust because it's so centralized that other doctors are not really allowed to chime in. And then there's also almost like a predetermined conclusion that all these thyroid cancers, which now number 2,200, right, are not related to Fukushima Daiichi meltdowns. It's already concluded by the international authorities, like a United Nations Scientific Committee on the effects of atomic radiation. They just came out, advanced copy came out just as, early this month, in just before the 10th anniversary of Fukushima. They preemptively said there is really no connection that they can really attribute. So, Norma, do you want to say more to that?
Well, the thyroid cancer is the most salient issue, but yes, there are hospital records. And the difficulty is having the resources to analyze the data from hospitals. So, I mean, one major hospital in Tokyo has shown the mounting rate of leukemia, for example, but I don't think it's been analyzed by an epidemiologist or a scientist capable of doing that. A journalist who himself contracted a rare form of stomach cancer, said that the National Cancer Institute of Japan has made its database much more accessible. So if people wanted to look into this, they could. And he wrote an article, sometimes he published it last fall, I think, showing manifest increase in stomach cancer since 2011. But the data, I mean, as usual, if the data are published, they lag. So National Cancer Institute comes up only to 2016, I think, but stomach cancer. And I think this kind of other cardiovascular diseases, these have all been reported by people who have looked at particular hospitals, but never carefully analyzed. I think that, again, the resources are so skewed. Who has the resources? The professionals who have the resources, and a government whose official policy is to keep promoting nuclear. Researchers aren't going to get big funding to do research that's going to that could produce unwelcome results. So it's a very difficult issue, and I am so grateful to the brave scientists and citizens who try to keep an eye on these things.
And I think we also have to think about mental health issue, which is a huge phenomenon in Fukushima. Norma and I watched this incredible lecture by mental health care doctor working in Fukushima. And he was basically saying that the prevalence of PTSD in Fukushima is just staggering. And they cannot heal because there's no real solution, right, to this conundrum. So they are almost deprived of opportunity to talk about it, because this, expressing concern the voice is marginalized. So I think mental health is a huge component of our health, well-being too.
There's a question I just want to say from Jan Boudart that I don't understand. If you could maybe retype it, it would be helpful. Something about the coastline, but it's not really comprehensible. So I would encourage you to retype your question. In the meantime, I'm going to go to a question from Claire Gillis, which is maybe what will be one of our last, because we're ending the program soon. But what do you think are some concrete steps that Japan could take to denuclearize its power? And how likely is that to happen? Did the scale of the Fukushima disaster cause people to rethink nuclear energy? You just touched on that a little bit, but we know in the wake of Fukushima, for instance, Germany immediately closed all its GE Mark I reactors, which, by the way, the Vermont Yankee plant was the same design Mark I reactor. It is now closed. there's some still operational in the United States. They're among the oldest reactors in the United States, and there are some inherent problems with them that have been recognized. But Germany has phased out nuclear power now. France was reprocessing and is now cutting back on its nuclear power as a percentage of its electrical needs. But yet it seems like Japan closed them all initially, but then started reopening again and is now even building a reprocessing plan to help deal with all of this waste coming up from Fukushima. So what is the state of the thinking on nuclear power in Japan today?
I can say that the public sentiment is, I think, more than majority, 50% against Japan's, heavy reliance on nuclear power anymore. I think that is a definitely trend. However, the policymakers, which also pressured by the industry, because there's so much money tied in the nuclear industry in Japan, they think probably that Japan cannot quickly turn around and abandon all this nuclear infrastructure that they have invested, because banks are part of it. But that, I think, in a way, is shackling the whole nation. I mean, Japan is an earthquake-prone country. Even yesterday, oh my goodness.
Mhm.
I mean, almost practically every month there's a big earthquake, right? So there's not a will to change at the current Japanese administration. I mean, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I think there was a lot of recommendations from the International Atomic Energy Agency and also the Nuclear Regulatory Commission here in the United States, which tends to set the tone internationally and even at the IAEA. And there was lessons learned from Fukushima, and they're costly lessons. They've raised the price of doing nuclear safer, has also raised the cost of the energy produced by nuclear facilities to make it non-competitive now with other true renewables and other energy sources. So that is one of the reasons you see the decline of nuclear power worldwide. I think.
Oh, so I still want to raise the point of nuclear. Some people would like to say it's a clean energy, and it's an important part of mix for the combating climate crisis. That is a completely misleading argument, because first of all, the amount of money and fossil fuel used to maintain nuclear power plants. Well, once they start operating, they might use their own electricity, but in order to construct, and also even after they stop generating power, it has to be, you have to receive input to keep it from blowing up. So even it's sitting idle, nuclear power plant sitting idle, they require energy. So it is really a backward kind of thinking, right? To call nuclear power clean energy.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that in chat, we posted a 2-minute animation by Fairwind's Energy Education called Smokescreen. So if you go to the head of the chat, you'll see the URL for that. It's a very useful tool for showing how impractical, never mind all the moral qualms that I take very seriously about exposure for normal operation and in the case of a catastrophe, but how impractical it is as a way to address climate change.
The last question we'll take today, Jan has retyped her question, and she says a quotation from one of the steles. Do you know what that is? The steles begins, "Remember the great tsunami, protect your family." Do you know which great tsunami is being referred to? Do you know what this question is about?
Yeah.
Okay, could you respond, please?
Except I don't have the dates down. There are several on coastal northern Japan that are stone markers. about there's one from the late 19th century. There's another one from the Chile earthquake of the 1930s, I think. And then going further back in the centuries, but there are stone markers that people have left saying, don't build past here, which people suddenly noticed after this disaster happened.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead, Chiho.
No, I can't remember the exact dates either. But Chile earthquake might be 50s, I think, because I remember my cousin was born on the day of that. So yeah, but it just goes to show that there are many really big ones. And I think new modeling shows that we are due for another or more really catastrophic earthquake in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you, ladies. It's 5:30 now. A copy of this video will be available on the Windham World Affairs Council website, on our YouTube channel, and on Brattleboro Community Television. So share it with your friends if you found it of use. And I'd like to just let people know that as part of our film series this summer, we'll be showing a brand new film called Journey to the Safest Place on Earth, which is a German film where they went around for 10 years to look at all the different projects to create a permanent repository for nuclear waste. It's a wonderful, informative, non-polemical film. It's very interesting. So look out for that for future programming at Windham World Affairs Council. And I'd like to thank everyone, particularly our guests, Norma Field and Chiho Kaneko, for sharing their reflections on Fukushima with us today. Thank you so much. There's more resources also at our website that Chiho and Norma put together with more factual analysis than we were able to deal with today. So please do avail yourself of that information on the website. And
I'll just
have a wonderful, did you want to say something quickly?
I did. I just wanted to add that the questions that we weren't able to answer just now will be submitted to Norma and Chiho. So they will see those and respond to you as well. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you, and have a great day, everybody. Have a good weekend. And,
Thank you.
it should be
thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.